what I thought I'd talk about, very related to what you just heard, is the road ahead for India. And the road ahead, obviously, I'm an economist, I'm going to talk a lot about the economics. But I think the road ahead is also about the politics, how the politics fits with economics, in other words, the political economy. So I start with the notion that, over the last so many decades, people have argued that democracy holds back Indian growth and development, that what India needs is strong leadership, authoritative leadership even, which will not have checks and balances on it, and which will do what is needed for Indian development. And what people have in mind when they say this is something like China, a model which emphasizes the production of goods and capital, not ideas and human capabilities. And they want India to follow that path, which has been extremely successful in China, in East Asia, the export-led growth model. Now, China is seeing the limits of that model and is trying to change. And I would argue that we need to be cognizant of all the limitations there, as well as how the world is changing. And in fact, what we need now is a truly Indian way. And I'm going to make the case for that today. So let's start with what alarms people about India's growth in the last few decades. And it's the extent to which Indian job growth, especially growth out of agriculture, has been in services and construction, not in manufacturing. The traditional path is people leave agriculture for manufacturing, manufacturing grows, eventually manufacturing starts declining as people start demanding more goods and services, and as manufacturing becomes really productive, and then people move into services. And ultimately, services becomes dominant. Today, in most Western economies, services account for 70% of GDP. Most developing economies, typically agriculture is really dominant, then manufacturing sort of increases. China, it's about 35% of GDP, and then eventually it starts going down. India, it hasn't gone beyond 20% of GDP for 4 decades now. So India has been stuck, in some sense, in manufacturing. Now, within services, we've expanded. We account for a lot more of GDP through services. This is not just low-skilled consumer services. There's a lot of it: retail, hotels, restaurants, leisure, but also construction. Think of the Kirana shop as the typical sort of service firm, small and not high in scale. But there's also been an explosion in the last few years in what one calls producer services: IT, design, finance, legal, consulting, and an explosion in those exports in the last few months, something that is worth noting. And these employ a small but fast-growing share of the population, especially high-skilled professionals. So we've got low-skilled services, but we've also got high-skilled services. Now, have we missed the manufacturing bus altogether? Absolutely not. We have a strong global presence in some areas. Two-wheelers, for example, we're the world's largest manufacturer. There's a lot of exports going into Africa. More recently, Royal Enfield started exporting its some motorcycles to the land of the Harley Davidson, and we've seen whiskey being exported from India to Scotland. So we can make things, but typically these are areas where not only do we have strong domestic demand, for example, two-wheelers, but skills like R&D and design are important. Think pharmaceuticals, a certain amount of R&D is useful. Where we do less well is low-skilled manufacturing, where low tariffs, strong logistics and transport, reliable and cheap power, ease of doing business, easy land acquisition, and a decently educated but docile, and importantly docile labor force are needed to be competitive. We simply don't have all these. We don't check all these marks. And this is where the bulk of low-skilled manufacturing jobs are the world over, and these jobs are also decreasing. So the question is, why didn't we get these jobs earlier? Why did China and Vietnam succeed? Now, on the positive side, communist economies emphasize primary and secondary education to a far greater degree than we did in the early part of our democracy. And they have ample numbers of moderately educated workers, the kind that can do the moderately skilled labor that modern industry requires. Moreover, their authoritarian states can acquire land easily and build out infrastructure. I mean, democracy like ours, because of all the checks and balances, because somebody like Lata Mangeshkar could protest the flyover outside a window and stop that in its tracks. That's why we simply cannot build out infrastructure as fast as everyone else in the communist world. China has built tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail, while we're struggling to build the railway between Mumbai and Ahmedabad, even though this is a show project of the current government. And probably, as I last checked, it's going to be finished in 2028, many years after it was announced, even though all the weight of the government is behind it. That's just a fact of our democracy. We build infrastructure more slowly. Think about trying to build out infrastructure in what we have is a first world civil society and almost a first world democracy, but we have a second world government capacity. And therefore it becomes much harder to do the things that in this country or in the United States, think of building a highway in the United States today. It would take a long, long time because of the various permissions and so on needed, as well as the NIMBY opposition that would set up. So India does that less well. But also, a lot of progress in China was made by local governments opening doors to favored businesses and removing bureaucratic and regulatory impediments to growth. In other words, as my colleague Chiang Kai-shek at Chicago says, competitive crony capitalism was a feature in China's strong growth. You needed help from the local government to break the rules, and that allowed local champions to emerge. Similarly, a key feature in China's growth was the suppression of labor unions and activism so that you kept wage growth below the growth of productivity, of labor productivity, and you also kept the rates that were paid to savers below competitive world rates. So cheap capital, cheap labor helped Chinese firms and helped them grow tremendously. In the longer run, this benefited the Chinese population, but it did require suppression of these kinds of market forces. Now, we cannot do all this. It's not even clear that we want to do it. Do we really want oppressive labor conditions? Do we want to suppress our unions to make sure that wages don't match productivity? We also have scored our own goals, right? We've made it harder for firms to grow in size without significant additional burdens. Economists have complained about Indian labor laws for long, which protect only a few workers while leaving many unprotected and hurt both the employer as well as the employed. We can do better, we should do better, but we haven't done so far. Similarly, we have an ambivalent attitude towards protectionism. We raise tariffs at, whenever some part of the production sector is hurt, depending on the extent of lobbying. And this kind of random tariff change makes it very hard for global supply chains to come through India. We're not part of regional trade agreements. Again, makes it hard for global supply chains to come through India. So we do need to do our homework also. But the net effect of all this is it's been very hard to do manufacturing of the scale that China is doing or of the scale that Vietnam is doing in India. Now, the government had been trying to make amends. And the way it says this is, look, there are all these deficiencies we have. That's a realistic acknowledgement. We're going to pay for that with what are called production-linked incentives. If you make in India, we will pay you some fraction of the final price for you to make in India to offset some of these deficiencies. And the idea somehow is, look, you start manufacturing in India, you bring some of your activity to India, the supply chains will start emerging, and all this will grow. It's a fine idea, but we need to check whether it works in practice. And the place where we started this relatively early was cell phones. We applied big tariffs on cell phone imports in 2018, ensured that cell phones somehow had to be quote-unquote manufactured in India, and today we have cell phone exports. Problem is, the data has to be looked at very carefully. Have we become a global manufacturer of cell phones? And the reality is, yes, we are exporting cell phones, but what we're doing is really basic assembly, which accounts for a really small fraction of cell phone value. In other words, whatever we're exporting, we're importing 90% of what we export. The value added in India is really small. A journalist recently wrote a piece saying we're adding a lot of value, yet the wrong numbers. When you look at the numbers of what we're importing and what we're exporting, we're still doing assemblies. We've expanded beyond assemblies to sub-assemblies. This is the lowest part of value added in the cell phone. Take an Apple cell phone, right? iPhone. It retails for $1,299. What fraction of it is manufacturing? It turns out a third is manufacturing. 2/3 is the service content of an iPhone. Okay? Of that 1/3 in manufacturing, about 90% is parts. The chip, the face, the motherboard, all that stuff is sort of stuff that goes in. The assembly is 2 to 3% of the value of the cell phone. We're doing that. We're not doing the rest. The rest is where the value is. The rest comes from intellectual property, it comes from design, it comes from R&D, it comes from the brain, not the brawn. Today, that is true of almost every product that is manufactured. And so, really the question is, should we be competing for the brawn? Or should we say, bygones be bygones, we can't compete for that. Those guys, let them take it. We want to compete for the brain. Now, I'm not saying we immediately move to just the intellectual property. There are many places where we can add substantial value also in manufacturing. The service component of manufacturing I've already talked about, but agri-industry is a big place where India can contribute a lot of value on the basis of very strong agriculture. And certainly we can increase productivity in agriculture, but we can also add value there. We also will, for a while, benefit from people looking at alternatives to China for the China +1 strategy, perhaps for geostrategic reasons, perhaps for diversification reasons. So people will come. By all means, we should not abandon manufacturing. But I would think if we want to put eggs in any basket, we should be thinking more of the service component of manufacturing or services more directly. Now, let me pause a second and just say, why was manufacturing so important in a country's development earlier? Well, for sure, it could take people from agriculture more directly in some of this low-skilled work. But also, export-led growth gave a poor country access to global demand. Once you had access to global demand, you could also have scale. Once you have scale, even with moderately skilled workforce, you could have higher productivity, you could compete with industrial country firms, and that could increase incomes locally, and you could be on a virtuous cycle upwards. So manufacturing became the ladder to income growth and overall growth. The problem is that ladder is not so effective anymore. Apart from the fact that now the labor component is much smaller, labor arbitrage has already taken place. We're not competing with the workers in the United States. We're not competing with the workers in the United Kingdom. We're competing with workers in Vietnam who are really cheap and really productive and have that kind of tariff and logistics support that we could get, but it's going to be really competitive. And so the value we're competing for has been pushed down. The place where competition still hasn't gotten as much hold, where there is some value we can capture, is certainly on the services side. Talking to an entrepreneur from Bangalore, he made a comment which sounds a little crude, but seems really to capture the idea. Do we want to be the serfs of the global production process, or do we want to be the lords of the production process? If you want to be the lords, capture the place where the lords are adding value. If you want to be the serfs, focus on low-skill manufacturing as a way to grow, and that's going to take a long time. So why not choose an alternative path? And then just again, I told you about the Apple iPhone. Think about the quintessential manufactured product, the car. The Chevy Volt, which is GM's sort of EV, in 2010, programming accounted for 40% of its value. The rest was all the parts and so on. So if we want to be part of a global supply chain, if we don't have the logistics to match everybody else, but we have a great digital infrastructure, why not be part of the programming part of that value chain? And we are. We are, except, you know, that is the hidden revolution that's going on in India today. We are getting to be part of global value chains. That's why service exports are booming, because we are insinuating ourselves into those parts through various kinds of manufacturing, various kinds of firms. But with what happened during the pandemic, and as you heard in the previous panel, we can also export a variety of new services which could not be traded earlier. Think of telemedicine, think of consulting. You know, my friend here is going to India to start up a process of, you know, hire a lot of people, of professionals. And I said, you're going to, she's a consulting, she's a senior partner in a consulting firm. I said, you're going to get a back office. She said, no, the days of back office are gone. This is actually a semi-front office. Those guys are going to make presentations to our clients here. Those guys are going to do the work. And, I mean, we get some of the business here, we're going to work with them. But it's no longer the case that they're going to do the PowerPoints that we present here. And I think more and more of services are going to go like that. Take telemedicine, right? This is a win-win situation if we can get the right structures. There's a shortage of doctors in the National Health Scheme in the UK, long waiting lists, and this will grow worse with aging because it's going to be harder to find professional doctors trained in this country. It's true of the whole of Europe. More than 40% of the doctors in Ireland or Norway are foreign. And so they will need professionals from the rest of the world. Now, you could import all of them by allowing tremendous levels of immigration. Or you could do services at a distance, which, you know, allows India to benefit from those doctors because they have a local practice, but allows them to export to the UK through telemedicine. So telemedicine would be great, but we need to try and make some changes to make that possible. For example, the NHS has to be able to pay Indian doctors for the services at a distance. There has to be a way of guaranteeing the quality of services. There has to be mutual recognition of qualifications. Indian medical degrees given by strong institutions should be recognized. So services can be exported today when they couldn't. Also, services are much less dependent on scale than manufacturing. It doesn't just need to be export-led services, it can also be domestic-related services. We have a huge need for education. We have a huge need for healthcare. The COVID pandemic reflected that. We can grow a lot by even servicing our own demand, not necessarily just the export demand. And finally, there are many things which have brought down the need for scale in services. You know, one of the biggest explosions, my friend Ramananda at Imperial tells me, one of the biggest explosion in services was because of cloud computing. Once you had cloud computing, you didn't have to buy the hardware, you didn't have to buy the whole network in order to be able to sell products. You just bought the cloud services and everything came with that, right? So again and again, what we're seeing is the way to grow is changing. The old large-scale manufacturing-led growth for exports is just one possibility. There are many other possibilities, some of which are much more attuned to India's strengths, right? So, one example of something we could do. Let me just emphasize, I'm not saying abandon the manufacturing bus. You know, try and catch it. It left the station long back, try and catch it. But in the process of running to catch it, let's not forget the services bus is drawing up. And the services bus is much easier for us to catch, and it was also something that we risk missing. It's a high-value bus We can do it now. Now, we have to recognize in all this that the biggest value in this new world is essentially from intellectual property embedded in products, right? And what we have to think more and more is how can we create those products, those apps, the platforms. How can we create 5G, for example, that we can sell to the rest of the world? Now, a lot of 5G is software. The hardware, a lot of it can be commoditized. But 5G, linking all that together, is about software. We have an advantage there. We can create that. But most important, I would argue, our biggest advantage is our democracy. Would you trust 5G that is sold to you from an authoritarian neighbor or an authoritarian country? No, because you worry about the backdoors that are built in. You worry that they might spy on your citizens. You worry that they may be blackmailed. You want a certain level of checks and balances on the other country to be able to start to trust the possibility of 5G being sold from there. India is in a good position. In fact, we're doing some of this already. There is an organization called NOSPI in IIIT Bangalore, which sells ID, such as we already created, the Aadhaar system, sells aspects of the India stack to a number of other countries. But it has a transparent governance structure, it has open source software, etc., all of which inspire trust in the other country, that this is not a backdoor way for us to take you over. This is really about helping you. And think about that magnified many times over when you're providing consulting services. You need to convince the other place that you're not sort of getting backdoor entry in their firms, finding out what they're doing, and then use that to either get an advantage or blackmail them. For that, you have to convince them that you are bound by the rule of law. Not just you, your government is bound by the rule of law. They can't look into your books based on whim and fancy. For that, we need to strengthen our democracy, our checks and balances, our strong data protection law. It's in our interest, our economic interest, to keep the government from prying, because that will enable us to convince the rest of the world that the government is not going to pry into the work of our businesses. That will help our businesses sell. That will be a comparative advantage relative to Chinese and Vietnamese and Russian firms. And that's something we should be thinking about. I think there are other advantages we have. When we think about services, we have a very strong technology base. We have a good reputation for high quality services. Many of the people in this room, when you think about doctors in many countries, you think about Indians. You talk about computer programmers, you think about Indians. You talk about consultants, they think about Indians. So we already have a reputation. We don't have as much of a reputation in manufacturing, but we have a reputation in services. Let's build on it. We have the English language, which our friends in this room, their ancestors gave to us. That's an advantage. That enables us to communicate easily with the globe. Yes, ChatGPT Plus eventually will help in instantaneous translation, but better talk to somebody directly than through a machine. So in that sense, we have an advantage that others are getting, but it takes time. We over-invested in our early years in higher education. That's why there's so many well-qualified people here from India. That's an advantage now. Let's not give it up. That gives us the ability to create very high-quality personnel. We need to work much more. We are losing that advantage because we are letting the quality of our universities erode. We need to build on them to have first-rate universities across the world. And most importantly, and this I want to emphasize and then I'll end, our independent judiciary, our liberal democracy. These are critical advantages if we are to go down the service, manufacturing service-led growth path, because this will enable us to earn the world's trust. It's intrinsically necessary. I mean, we want democracy as Indians, but we also want democracy to be able to convince the world that we can be trusted, that we can be effective providers of these kinds of services. And so I would argue that, as far as we go, we need to do our homework in strengthening our institutions, in strengthening our democracy, You've heard examples of how, there are lots of positives. Our democracy keeps surprising us with its resilience, but we need to do more. And lastly, people often ask me, you keep saying this, oh, I hear you're not against manufacturing. I thought you were. You're basically saying, let's sort of focus on the area we're stronger in, where we have a comparative advantage, rather than abandon manufacturing. I hear that. But what does that mean in terms of resource allocation? And I'll tell you what it means. It means that we don't spend $10 billion subsidizing chip factories, when in fact we could spend $10 billion on opening 100 top quality universities, 1,000 top quality secondary schools, or 10,000 primary schools. We need to focus on human capital, not build more chips, which are going to be, it's going to take us 30 years to get to the 20 years to the frontier, maybe 10 years if we're really optimistic. But there's only a glut in chips. Chip manufacturing is not where the value is. Where the value is in chip design. We already have a presence in chip design. And if we produce 10,000 engineers a year of high quality, we can be a global presence in chip design. So why not do that, rather than pour money into a bucket of, which is very, very deep, and we don't know what the success will be from that. China has spent, hundreds of billions of dollars in trying to get a chip industry. It's nowhere near the frontier. Last question, and I'll stop after this. Don't we need chips to be secure? And you hear this again and again. We need manufacturing. There's talk of superpower. We need manufacturing to be the superpower. First, we don't need it if we don't make enemies of the industrial world. So long as we're friendly with countries that make it, the United States is building enormous chip factories at enormous expense to the government. We can always buy chips there because there will be periodic gluts anyway. But chips are available. There's the market for chips. Moreover, if we increase our capacity on chip design, we will also be crucial in that supply chain. So, put differently, and I'm happy to discuss this a little more, we need to create the scientists, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and firms that will give India many more lords and fewer serfs in the global arena. And that makes more sense than aping other governments in subsidizing chip manufacturing and spending billions of dollars in something that's going to employ very few Indians and not really give us the security that we need. As a resource-strapped country, we need to spend much more cleverly. So, in sum, to end, we need an Indian growth path that draws on the capabilities of all Indians and builds on our historic culture of tolerance and respect for all. You hear this term Vishwa Guru thrown around, and I think we can be that, but not based on the ideas of the past. Yes, we can respect our past, but because we have a new vision of inclusive, green, local-led, service-based growth and development, and we persuade the world that it works by showing, in fact, that it works. So, we have homework to do. We have to focus on every Indian getting a chance at doing those high-skilled jobs. And often, all it takes is the right education, skilling, healthcare, and finance. And we need to do much more on this. But we can do it. And to improve delivery of these, we need to remedy the mistakes of the past, including the excessive centralization and the top-down decision-making, which historically has inhibited our ability to deliver public services. We need to make public services much more responsive to the people, then we will get higher quality public services. We require a learning, responsive government, and we need to strengthen the institutions of democracy. We need to offset the erosion that has been taking place in the last few years. But I think that if we do this, we can have a manifesto for change which is different from what other countries are embracing. In our 75th year of independence, I think India's best years are still ahead. But we have a lot of work to do. I hope we're involved in that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. The mics are on. audience, just start with 3 questions. I'll come to the audience in a minute, so your hand got tired for so long. To begin with, thank you for that wonderful and enlightening presentation. There is one aspect which is fairly recent. I was wondering if there are any predictive models or any theses that would kind of predict what will happen, which is AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning. I have attended a presentation by a very celebrated doctor who has demonstrated how machine learning tools have an accuracy of detecting cancer based on scans and tests that are sent to them, which are in fact better than some doctors. AI is going to take service jobs before anything else. You know, it's CAs, lawyers, and in some cases even journalists, as we've been seeing. You know, you can't detect reported by journalists than from AI. I was wondering, amongst economists, is there any model that predicts how that would work in this very fast-changing technology?
No, people have obviously. This is early days for the technology, and clearly, as with any such technology, there would be certain jobs that are easier to automate, to replace. The hope is that what this will do is be an add-on. That is, I mean, the very crude version is Excel didn't replace some clerks who jotted down stuff and added up columns, but also was a way for people to, you know, do a lot of calculations very easily, and therefore made their jobs easier. And the hope is that what this will do is take out some routinized elements of jobs while leaving some other elements available. Now, there is a lot of fear that this will go beyond that. You know, there's this notion that somehow creativity can be outsourced to ChatGPT plus. And the problem to some extent thus far is that first, must remember that in a sense this is all correlations. And because language has a rationale to it, it sort of picks up the rationale in language. But the sense that this is thinking for itself, no. It's just finding out what the correlations are in a way which is far beyond our imagination, so that it does seem to some extent like thinking. But because we can't sort of unwind how that happens, at least for now we can't be completely sure how it actually works. And so you can replace some routine stuff where you're sure that it's not going to go off track. But this concept of hallucination is, it can go crazy if you leave it unchecked.
Sure.
But also there are elements where it doesn't, because it's not thinking, it's not doing what decent people would do.
Right.
It's breaking the rules. And sometimes breaking the rules can be tremendously damaging to a company. So do you really want to allow something which can break the rules? In other words, I think for a long while, it probably is going to be available in a very controlled environment, in which it's going to be more an add-on rather than a replacement. Increasingly, we will trust our knowledge of it enough that it becomes replacements, for example, for the first layer of customer service.
Translations.
Or translations. And so, you know, we will have to have people sort of move to higher levels of activity. And there will be a whole lot of people who will have to change jobs. You know, once you had the horse and carriage go away, the carriage driver had to change. Maybe they became a car driver. So there will be disruption in society. There will be disruption in a variety of services. But almost surely, you will have to have higher order education, higher order skills to still add value. And the people who can do that probably can add much more value because it's augmented or transformed by this kind of, think of it as capital, a machine. You're augmented by the machine. And so I think this just reinforces the need for us to focus on our human capital, on focusing on more, you know, better education, better creativity, better debate. That ideas is going to be where the value remains. I mean, sometimes there's this notion that, oh, yeah, but you still have to put stuff together. Those manufacturing jobs will remain. Well, those manufacturing jobs will also be ChatGPT'd out by robots.
Then already, assembly has already been done by robots.
Yeah, so in that sense, I think we have no option but to go upscale.
But do you worry, because you spoke about the intersection of politics and economics, or the political economy, and in politics, the polarization that we see the world over, and wealth inequality, and even in income inequality, because wealth inequality to far larger extent is at record highs ever since records have been kept. In that environment, while being a Luddite is a pejorative, I heard a podcast where the Luddites weren't altogether wrong. It did take away jobs, but while they did come back, one generation had to lose a lot for the subsequent generations. So while conflict in society wasn't as connected as it is today in the social media age, in an age of record inequality in wealth, in an age of polarization and conflict like we've never seen before, that generation that is going to lose so that future generations may gain, do you worry how that may play out in world politics and economics?
No, for sure. Any kind, so think of the extreme, where a few tech trillionaires own ChatGPT Plus or variants of that, and nobody else has a job. Is that a society that can sort of survive? And the answer is no. Because the rest are not going to sit and protect the property rights of the few and say, oh yeah, we're going to send all our money to you and you own all the robots. No worries. There is going to be a huge press for redistribution, right? Ideally, what you want is the rest to be able to do something which is useful given, now, if all the work in the world is taken over by robots, Keynes thought about this when he was writing the economic prospects for our grandchildren. And he said the real trouble will be for us to figure out ways to enjoy ourselves. How will we spend time when we don't have to do work anymore? And so, let's not rule out the possibility that this is a good thing. That some of this work, especially the drudge work being taken away, is a good thing. We'll say, why were we translating all those boring things before? But creative translations, there may still be room for that. So in other words, we may move up in work, we may have more leisure time, but this requires a restructuring of society. Otherwise we'll have an implosion or an explosion because a lot of people don't partake of these benefits. So in other words, we have to recreate society at the same time as we're recreating work. That's always happened. We just have to do it at a faster pace if this happens as fast as it's supposed to happen. But last point, before we get off this, I think there's always a lot of hype around technological development, right? You know that. 6 years ago, when I came back from India to the US, I had to buy a car. And I decided that for the first time in my life, I would lease a car. Because I thought, with all the hype around, automatic driving cars were going to come. That driverless cars were on the way, and I'd be stuck with a petrol car which I had to drive. So I wanted to lease it so I could give it back and buy that fully driverless car when it came. It's still probably another 6, 7, 10 years away, right? Why? Because even though we've gotten to a high level in driverless cars, we want really to reduce the possibility of error close to zero before we feel happy with driverless cars. So it's very controlled environments in which we are allowing them, but not on the roads. So it's going to take some time. I would think the same is true for ChatGPT Plus and its inroads in the rest of the world. It will take, you will see some easy places where it is used. But for it to replace a lot of work will take time. We'll figure out how to use it along with workers. My sense is, if it reduces all our work a little bit, but we find a way to redistribute the income, even better.
We find a way to redistribute the income being the operative part.
It requires political adjustment, absolutely.
This is my last question, then I'll come to the audience, because I may not get a chance to ask a question of an economist with their eminence. I'm a news professional. I've been in news for about 30 years now, and I feel that with the traditional market philosophy and logic, which I agree with, that markets is best for price discovery, for resource allocation, and for providing a better product to the consumer. I have found in the last 30 years, news has had the opposite effect. The more players there are, the quality of news has gone down. Just the damaging aspects of it have outweighed the positive aspects, and they have been positive aspects or not. I was wondering briefly, have you given it any thought that is news a case of market failure, just like CNN has been getting a lot of criticism for that Trump interview that they did 2 years ago, which is only for ratings and not for any journalistic inquiry. Do you think there is a logic to the news model, whether it's a subscriber-driven model, whether it is an ad-driven model, or is it an inevitable market failure?
So I'm an optimist on this, right? If you look at the turn of the 20th century, the 19th to the 20th, there was a huge amount of press in the US. It was called the muckraking press. And it was exactly what we fear about all this low quality news with a lot of error, facts that weren't facts and so on. And eventually it sorted itself out. There were tabloids, or their version of tabloids, which contained all the sensationalism with modest accuracy. And then there was the New York Times or the Washington Post that emerged from that as this is where sort of things are checked. Of course, they make errors also every so often. But the point is that the system eventually gets tired of not being able to tell, especially when the level of noise gets to a high level. And then sources emerge, say, okay, we actually are closer to the truth because we employed this, that, and something else. And my sense is something like that will continue to emerge over time, which sort of straightens out the need to, tell good from bad. And there may be some people who don't care. There's some people who want those all the sensational stuff of modest accuracy. But some people really want to know that what they're reading has been checked at least once, even if they're not sure it's true.
Clearly an optimist. So I'll come to the audience. I just have one request. Please keep your questions short, and please make sure it is a question so we can take as many as possible. Because there are a lot of hands up, and I would like to come to as many people as possible. If it goes too long, I may be a little impolite and cut in, and I hope I don't have to do that. So let's start with the lady there, and then I'll come to the gentleman there. So we'll get a mic here. We'll go to the gentleman there, the back after that, and then to the lady here. Yeah, these are the first three. And I repeat, if you could keep your question as short as possible, and that it is a question.
Thank you for such an informative and insightful session. Can you hear me clearly? How do we distribute growth across India to narrow the inequalities? Thank you.
Yeah, take the question.
Okay, look, I think this is a big question, right? And I think it's very important. And so I think we need to focus far more on how we create good public goods, education, healthcare, access to opportunity. We have some examples of it. I think the AAP government in Delhi has focused a lot on improving the quality of the schools, and obviously one has to verify and monitor that process. But they've seen that as job one, and we need to do that more across the country. The Tamil Nadu government, which I work with, took as one of its important challenges how to bring kids back to school after the pandemic in a way that they landed smoothly into their coursework and so on, and they created a whole new program to do that. So we need more sort of local engagement for that. One of the problems that I constantly harp on is that many school systems in India are governed at the state level, when in fact the experience is at the local panchayat or the district level. could we sort of decentralize more of the governance so that parents, villages have more control over the quality of the teaching? If the schoolmaster doesn't show up, can they have more direct effect rather than having to go complain at the state capital that this person is not showing up? So I think decentralized governance can be a big factor in improving the quality of public services that we get in India. I think many more state governments are seeing this as important because, if you have poor quality schools, you have poor quality students emerging from that. And in this day and age where degrees are very important, they don't get access to the best colleges, and it's not a great career path. So we need to do more, and we need to spend more. I don't think spending is the most important need, but it is not. It cannot be ignored. That certainly on healthcare, certainly on education, the more we do, the more our people will be capable of dealing with ChatGPT Plus and surviving it.
The gentleman in the back. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Sekhri. Mr. Raghuram, you are an inspiration and my senior from the same school, so glad to meet you.
DPS? Or?
Yeah, DPS right. Everything that you speak is watched closely by the government and the opposition. So my question is on a little lighter note. 10 years down the line, do we see you as the next FM or the PM of the country?
Any chance you step into politics?
Look,
are you already there?
No, I'm not even. I'm not going to take that question seriously. I will say that really what I'm engaged in. Why do we keep talking about India? Lots of people want to stop talking about India, and the reason I talk about it is because I really feel that we are at a crossroad. We do have choices to make, and if we make the right choices, I'm not bothered about India being a little part. That to me is not the point. The point is going back to what the father of the nation wanted, that you make every Indian happy. How do we do that? That should be our focus. And I think we're at a crossroad where we have to choose, and we can choose.
The lady here, yeah.
Mr. Rajan, thank you so much for your talk. Just on the point you made about the growth paths for India, where do you see things like a free trade agreement which the UK and India are currently negotiating? Where do you see a role of that? Is there enough two-way advantages in there?
Absolutely, but this is where I say we have to spend far more time, including in our presidency of the G20, which is almost done, to think about how do we create pathways for services exports. Now, the UK, 70% of the economy is about services. Can we think about how we facilitate service exchange between India and the UK? To focus the free trade agreement primarily on agriculture and manufacturing is missing the biggest part of the gains to trade from both countries. The UK has tremendous capabilities in knowledge production. You have three great universities. You have a tremendous presence in bioscience, certainly in artificial intelligence. India could benefit, and there could be tremendous gains from trade. How do we, the starters? I see that we're making taking some steps forward, mutual recognition of degrees, but we could do far more. If we can do that, I think, this would be a fantastic step forward.
Gentleman here.
Thank you, Raghuram Rajan. So my question is on, you talked about design thinking mindset and keeping that as a top layer. It's been ages, decades we have been in employment, when you go to the schools, if you ask any kid, they'll be I want to be a software engineer, I want to be this. It's more like mindset of thinking towards getting an employment rather than being an entrepreneur or being into the design thinking mindset. My question is, what should the policy makers do to get into the schools, those schools, ground level schools, to change that mindset for the kids, to make it future ready? Two is, we see a lot between central and state governments, there's no amenable nature sometimes, and that creates some fuzz and doesn't actually deliver the best for the kids in the schools. So what should be these policymakers between central and state government should do to make that change the mindset of the kids as a policy, and kind of work together to make it better for tomorrow?
So I don't know that we know how to change mindsets, but I would say, creating a liberal atmosphere in the school, allowing different voices, different thoughts. It's when you regiment the school and say, this is what you must think, this is how you must think. And if you think outside this box, you will be punished. That's when you get the sort of very narrow, uncreative thinking, right? So allowing for rebellion, allowing for different thinking. Sometimes that's the beginning of great out-of-the-box thinking. Einstein wasn't a great student in his school, but that's because he spent a lot of time just wondering about and thinking about other stuff. So I think we need more liberal colleges. I'm not saying liberal arts, but just liberal in the sense of allowing more open curriculum. You can take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, forcing people to think more. And as they think more, they come to the realization that all the thought was not invented elsewhere. We can invent new thought ourselves. That confidence that you don't have to be a prisoner of your past, you don't have to be a prisoner of somebody else's present. You can be your own. I think, how do we do that? And that, to my mind, is to encourage debate, encourage argument, encourage free thinking. And that also requires a change in public life. Today it's all about, you hurt my sentiment, so I'm going to be angry with you, I'm going to sue you, I'm going to put you in prison. That's not the India that we need if we want to be an idea superpower. We need to have open dialogue. That's what we need to build on.
Okay, we need to wind up. I'm just going to do 2 more questions. I'm sorry, I know there are a lot more. We'll just take one from the lady, then we come to gentleman, and then we can wind up. I'm so sorry, I know there are lots, but I hope Dr. Rajan can interact with some people here at lunch.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rajan. My question, if I may, is to bridge a little bit from the previous panel into your panel, and also to look a little bit outside of India and hear your thoughts more about India's role, particularly on the international financing system. A month from now, President Macron is hosting a financing summit to really address some of the major global challenges that were referenced on the first panel. I'd love to hear your thoughts, particularly about India's role as a leader in leading the thinking around how this international system needs to change. I mean, fundamentally, the current system is out of date, particularly the multilateral institutions. And I would love to see much more leadership from India in this space about what the new system needs to look like. And I'd love to hear your thoughts today about where we could be taking a greater role there. Thank you.
So given the time, I mean, we could spend a long time talking about what needs to be done on the climate front. Let me say quickly 2 things. One, yes, I like the idea in the previous panel, we should be focusing on common aversions. And clearly, climate is a huge threat. It is perhaps India's most important threat, because South Asia is going to be at the center of climate disruption. All this talk about wet bulb days and so on. It's going to be hard to live in some places in South Asia, but also our dependence on the monsoon. Rainfall volatility is going to increase, and that's going to be problematic on either end. So we need to do a lot. It benefits us if there's much more climate action, and we need to be participants in that. I mean, there is a lot of value to India's position that, we want the guys who put it out there. But at the same time, we can't sort of make that the basis for inaction. We need to push for action because ultimately it's going to affect us. So I certainly think we need to emphasize that financing is a big part of what needs to happen. And we need to think about creative ways of finance plus subsidy, so that there's an element of subsidy which allows us to do some of the global public goods aspect of this, and in a sense a payment for the fact that we're stopping way before we reach the levels that industrial countries are at. That said, I would say that almost surely a large part of the investment in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, given the pace at which we're going on mitigation, will have to be on adaptation, not mitigation. And the world wants the rest of the world to mitigate, yeah, because it helps everybody else. But our more immediate concern is we're going to blow through 1.5 degrees. We're going to have much more terrible weather situations. We need to invest in adaptation because otherwise we're toast. If we neither do mitigation nor adaptation, almost surely we'll have migration. And migration is something, uncontrolled migration is something the industrial world does not want. So it is crisis time. India has to take a role. It has to keep saying, look, we didn't do it, but it also has to say, how do we sort of participate in the new design? And that design has to have elements of both mitigation and adaptation.
Right, last one quick question and a quick answer because we are running behind schedule.
Yes, on your suggestion that democracy is not just an ideal in itself, but it's something India could monetize through winning credibility for services. Is this an idea that is finding some sort of actionable awareness in the Indian government?
Look, I do think, so I do think it has intrinsic merit, but I'm trying to get people to see that it has value for India's future, because there are some people who put more value on the economic future than on the intrinsic merits of democracy. Is it getting bite? I don't know. I don't want to answer that. It's probably something I should leave for.
Yeah, but it's a good thesis. I enjoyed it very much. It was an original thought. But thank you so much, Dr. Rajan. It has been a privilege and a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for being after this, we will just take a 3-minute break, and I'll be in conversation with Siddharth Yog, serial entrepreneur, philanthropist, and startup founder and investor. One question. So we will just reconvene for that session after this.